My name is Vanessa Mio, and I'm the Education Registrar here, and we're so happy to have you. Trees Atlanta's mission is to protect and improve Atlanta's urban forests by planting, conserving, and educating. Just some housekeeping to make sure that we have a positive and efficient interactive experience. We want to welcome any questions that you have. Use it at the bottom of the screen, and I will read those toward the end of the presentation, and those questions will be answered live. So again, use the Q&A button at the bottom, or use the chat feature, whichever is most comfortable for you, and those questions will be answered. So at the end, after the presentation, we will welcome you to complete a survey that will be emailed to you. If you can complete that so that we can learn different ways to serve you better. And we are always welcome to your feedback. Please feel free to sign up for our newsletter to learn more about upcoming events and opportunities at treesatlanta.org. You could also see what we're up to on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Some upcoming events we have are this weekend, Saturday, we have our floral forest restoration at Lake Charlotte Nature Preserve. And that's going to be from 9 to 12 p.m. And on Sunday, June 12th, we have our Southside Trail Tour that will be starting at Glenwood Park. And that will be from 9 to 12 p.m. More information about these are also listed on our website, along with a host of other events that I'm sure you all will enjoy for every age group. So check that out. And for today's Lunch and Learn, we have Taryn Heidel, who is our Trees Atlanta Forest Restoration Manager, and Brian Williams, who is our Director of Urban Forestry. Again, we're so happy to have you, and I'm going to pass it on to Taryn and Brian.
Hello, everybody. Just getting set up. All right, cool. So we've got a lot of things to go over with you guys today. So we're gonna try to sell you on our new event called Conserve the Forest, which Vanessa just mentioned, one of the events that we're hosting on Saturday. We're gonna go over what restoration is, the history of restoration work at Trees Atlanta, which this was pretty fun for us to do because we had to do some digging to see what we did back in 1999, the top 5 invasive plants, and how to get involved. So to sell this new event that we're doing, Conserve the Forest is a new volunteer event. And the whole goal of it is to have a project in each of the 12 city council districts. We're doing it over 2 days. So the first day is Friday, and then Saturday. We still need volunteers for Lake Charlotte, so that's why that one was highlighted. But the whole goal of the event is to make it more education-based and not just a removal project. So we'll be focusing on a lot of times a new site that we don't usually work in, and then as well highlight an invasive plant, teach you how to identify it and how to remove it, and give you some more resources on how to get involved in your community and in your own backyard. So take a look. That website is, you have to follow that URL. You can't really navigate it from our website. So if you're interested in any of the 12 projects over the next couple of days, or there are more than 12 projects, there are 14 projects actually. But if you're interested in doing that, there's a map, and then there's going to be a bunch of information on that website afterwards as well. So what is restoration? This photo from the right was dug up from our archives. For those of you who aren't familiar or can't figure out where this is Kirkwood Urban Forest, the Dixie Street entrance from way back when, before we really started doing restoration work, and it looks completely unrecognizable now. I just think that's fun. But what is ecological restoration? Restoration is about allowing forests and other ecosystems to regenerate. So an ecosystem consists of all the organisms and the physical environment in which they interact. But much like human societies, ecosystems are much more resilient and healthier when diversity is increased. And specifically when we're talking about diversity, we're talking about native flora and fauna. So invasive plants outcompete native plants, and therefore they decrease the native plant diversity and therefore the native animal diversity, including insects. So removing invasive plants will also help increase beauty and visibility because they decrease kind of overgrown shrub and vine layers. So that's kind of in a nutshell what ecological restoration is. And we focus on two main ecosystems within the city. So we focus on forests and prairies as well, which we'll get into a little bit later. So when we remove, or what we focus on, there's kind of like three different plant categories. So you can think of it as native, non-native, and invasive. So the goal for restoration is removing invasive, reducing non-native, and planting natives. So a native plant is a plant that's part of that ecosystem. It has been for hundreds or thousands of years. So it's evolved with the other species in that ecosystem. And for the US, it's defined by plants that were found in the country before European settlement. We don't really have data about plants kind of that were moved around before then, so that's why that's used. A non-native plant is any plant that was introduced either purposefully or accidentally to that region by humans after that point. So that could be for agricultural purposes, cultural reasons, ornamental plants, anything like that. Or it could have, been with a shipping container accidentally. An invasive plant is a plant that is non-native and causes environmental harm. So it has to meet those two criteria, and it's always a non-native plant. So those invasive plants, unfortunately, we don't really know if they're going to become invasive when they're first brought here. We can guess based on how they grow in their own region, but a lot of times they're brought here and then we see them naturalizing, which means that they can reproduce viable seeds on their own and start spreading into areas surrounding where they are initially planted. And those then grow so aggressively that they outcompete natives because they don't have any competition. So some benefits of native plants specifically, since we've talked a little bit about invasives, there's a few benefits native plants. One is that they provide a sense of place. So they help us feel connected to the land and the people that first inhabited it. And these plants were used by native peoples for food, medicine, and goods. And you can learn a lot about a history of a place from its plants. If we planted all of the same non-native plants everywhere in the US would look exactly the same. There's a lot of ecological value for native plants. And non-native plants actually create food deserts for specialized insects and therefore birds. A large portion of specialized insects are caterpillars, so moths and butterflies. And that makes up a really large portion of fledglings. And so in order to keep population steady, which they are declining for many of our birds right now, we need to plant more native plants. And finally, conserving urban habitat and habitat in general, native plants are really beneficial for urban areas, especially are already seeing a lot of stresses and a lot of decline just due to habitat destruction. So anywhere we can plant native plants helps boost those little havens in an urban setting. So the big battle that we're struggling with restoration now, besides kind of funding issues and a lack of funding for restoration work in the past, is that there is a really big education gap with the public, since there isn't any requirements for labeling plants as invasive or native when you're buying and selling them. A majority of the invasives are actually spread from landscapes and are planted as ornamentals. So this percentage was taken from our common list of invasive plants. So 78% of the invasive plants that we remove are planted as ornamentals, which I think is a pretty surprising number, since most people, when they think of invasive plants, they think of kudzu, which isn't planted anymore as an ornamental. It was at one time. But the top 5 that we're going to talk about later today, which is English ivy, Chinese privet, Chinese wisteria, kudzu, and monkey grass, 4 out of 5 of those are still commonly planted as ornamentals today. little bit more about why invasive plants are harmful. So all layers of an ecosystem, whether that's canopy, understory, ground layer, they can all be affected by invasive plants depending on the invasive plant. So an invasive vine usually are more talked about because they can affect all different layers, because they can grow on the ground layer as well as affect canopy trees. But that doesn't mean that other invasive plants can't do the same amount of damage. So an invasive plant that only stays on the ground layer then can really decrease diversity of native plants in that layer that they reside in. But those invasive plants really impact the natural succession. So they can prevent a forest from becoming a climax forest, or they can actually reverse it by pulling down trees and keeping it into an open area like Kudzu often does. And like I said before, native plants biodiversity is affected and often reduced due to competition and increased ecological stress. And now I'm going to hand it off to Brian to talk about the good old days.
I get to talk about history of restoration at Trees Atlanta. And my disclaimer, I was here for some of this, not all of this. Very few of us were here for all of this. So we're going to get right into it. Here is our Trees Atlanta timeline of program growth from the beginning on the left-hand side. Our very first program in 1985 was the Urban Trees, the large tree planting program. And Neighborhoods came along in the early 90s, our volunteer tree planting program. And then Forest Restoration, we consider to be the third program. And we date that back to 99, which I'll explain in a minute, what we see as sort of the formative event of forest restoration. And so, you know, Trees Atlanta had been around almost 15 years at that point. BeltLine Arboretum program actually developed as an offshoot of some of our other programming later. And then we really went into education in 2009. And then our newest program, if you haven't heard about it yet, our Green Infrastructure program just started in 2019. So restoration program is kind of comfortably in the middle of things, not too old, not too young. So the very first activities that we consider restoration that Trees Atlanta embarked on, I would say fall under advocacy and management plans for green spaces. And so this event, the saving of Connally Forest in '99, we sort of use as our official benchmark of when restoration at Trees Atlanta officially started. Connally Park, if you don't know it, it's in East Point, and it is notable because there are some enormous old white oaks that are surrounded by forest now. They're actually older than that mature forest that has grown up around them from when the land was cleared and it was pasture for dairy cattle. So those trees are 100, 125, 150 years old. One of the trees, you may have heard of the Hank Aaron oak, largest white oak in the metro Atlanta area. I believe once considered the largest white oak in the entire state. Other special plants at Connally Forest, there are pink lady slipper orchids there, and that species is locally threatened. You do not find it often in the Atlanta area. The story behind this forest, the land had been decided on as a location for a new elementary school, and it was just going to be clear cut. And wind of that finally got to us, and enough sort of interested parties kind of came out to urge Trees Atlanta into action. And we worked with the community and with some other partners to really bring a lot of attention to what was going to happen and to save the forest. And we still work there now doing restoration work. And that is the official start of restoration at Trees Atlanta. And there is a AJC article from that time period with the guilty parties there on the right for helping to save the forest. The guilty parties. Other green spaces that Trees Atlanta helped preserve, some of these were in the early days to the present. Big Trees Nature Preserve up in North Fulton. That was going to be cleared to be a car dealership. If you've been up there, can you imagine that as a car dealership? Morningside Nature Preserve was going to be a housing development. And we worked with the neighborhood and with Charlotte Gillis in particular, who still works in that space. Kirkwood Urban Forest, That was sort of abandoned lots, and you saw the picture Taryn had earlier, covered with kudzu, very neglected. It could have been redeveloped, and the decision was made instead to preserve it and to restore it as green space that the Kirkwood neighborhood uses quite a bit. Beecher Hills, that was also going to be subdivisions, and we partnered with Bruce Morton, who's at the City of Atlanta, who also helped start Wawa, to save that. And most recently, we helped with the preservation of Lake Charlotte Nature Preserve, which at one point in time would have become a landfill. And that was the Canopy Alliance and the City of Atlanta also. You know, we don't want to take all the credit for that. We had the Trees Atlanta Greenspace Conference in 2000, which was funded by the Georgia Forestry Commission. And this was a workshop open to the public that really provided a lot of education on all aspects of restoration. We published this resource, this green space manual, which we still have available as a digital format, so we can still share that with folks. And it went through the whole range of restoration, how you evaluate the site, how you develop a plan for the site, how you would manage the green space, you know, how you work with volunteers, how you do a planting plan. There's just all kinds of information in this manual that is not entirely obsolete, even though we have not updated it in about a decade and a half. And so if anybody is interested in this, we do have this as a digital file that can be shared. And I do like to draw attention to the photo on the right here. Many of these people are still working at Trees Atlanta, either as staff or volunteers or have been board. We have Greg on the left there on the podium, Steve Sanchez seated, Alfie Vick, and I'm blanking on the fourth person, but people like to stick with Trees Atlanta. A little bit more information on Lake Charlotte Nature Preserve. So we started at least our portion of this project in 2019 with a feasibility study for once this area of land is acquired, you know, what's going to have to be done to make it a healthy green space and what's going to have to be done to make it accessible and safe for the public. We did some amazing GIS work with our GIS database to allow us to map a large area in much greater detail than we had been able to previously. And you see that patchwork looking map on the right. Those are all different transects that we made of the space to figure out what plants are growing there, what invasives are growing there, and where are they worst. And you can see the methodology we took. The worst of it are the darker colored squares. And then from this data that we took, we developed a 5-year management plan to hand over to the city based on the invasive plant survey of how you would need to manage this, this green space. And now we are still involved. We're actually overseeing the work being performed by the city's contractor on restoration of the space, just to make sure that the methodology is being followed accurately. And I think this project's going great. So we began doing restoration work with volunteers, doing volunteer projects and hiring contractors to do work in some green spaces next. Some of our early sites we show here: Connally Nature Park, which is what we saved, Morningside Nature Preserve, Kirkwood Urban Forest, and the Agnes Scott Green Space. Once upon a time that was called Oakhurst Green Space. That picture on the far right is Morningside Nature Preserve, I believe in the power line right of way. We got a grant from the Blank Family Foundation in 2007. That was sort of a multi-pronged grant, and it kicked off, it allowed us to plant some trees in the very first section of the BeltLine Arboretum, the 1 mile test section that's on the west side on White Street. And it also allowed us to do restoration in certain parks in the city of Atlanta. There were 10 BeltLine related parks that we called out in that grant. And that was Washington Park, Lang Carson Park, which is in Reynoldstown, John A. White Park, which is on the west side, Grove Park, also on the west side, Emma Milliken Park, which, Taryn, refresh my memory, that one is southwest, Perkerson Park, which is on the south side, Chosewood Park, also on the south side, Spring Lake Park, that's up the northwest, kind of near Collier Road, Renaissance Park, Grant Park, and Freedom Park. So this grant really allowed us to expand what we were doing in terms of invasive removal. For those of you who don't know about the Atlanta BeltLine Arboretum, and I'm gonna summarize the text here. Y'all feel free to read it while I talk. That map on the right, the green line is the BeltLine corridor. It's going to be a 22-mile loop around the historic downtown core of Atlanta. And it was Trees Atlanta's suggestion and idea and concept to layer an arboretum on top of the other infrastructure. So not only is it a way to get around the city and to take you from point A to point B, it is also a tree museum. So that you can go and you can see all these different cultivated tree and shrub species, a lot of southeastern grassland restoration rather than mowed turf. And what that does is it showcases a sustainable type of landscape management. It is ecosystem restoration. The BeltLine is habitat for wildlife. We're really trying to make it all things to all people. We call that a unicorn project, which if you've talked to people about the BeltLine, it is all things to all people. Here's some great shots of various parts of the BeltLine. This is the West Side Trail where RDA crosses over looking south, and that slope has got various native grasses. Pink muley is the pink one you're seeing there. Wildflowers, trees, and shrubs planted on it. This is on the East Side Trail. This is the West Side Trail, and there's a concept we developed for the trail shoulder where it needs to be mowable periodically to keep it clear. So we've got these lower growing flowers that resprout readily, rebloom multiple times in the year. The red one there is blanket flower, and the yellow is some type of annual coreopsis. This is another East Side Trail, I believe. And this is also East Side Trail, sort of towards the fall. A lot of these native prairie sections look their best late in the year. Well, a lot of them bloom in the fall, and they really hit their peak towards the end of the year. Decatur Cemetery was another project that we've been working on for well over a decade now. And we've got a long-standing, very good relationship with the city of Decatur, not just with restoration, but with planting as well. And so for this project, you see on the right-hand side there, it is a ravine with a creek in it behind the historic Decatur Cemetery that 10 plus years ago was just dripping with kudzu. That's it in its unrestored state. And the decision was made that it was going to be restored. There was an Army Corps of Engineer project to regrade the stream banks to get better flow in the stream to reduce some erosion. And the decision was made to restore the woodland around it. So we did extensive invasive removal, both contractors and volunteer projects. We did some prescribed grazing. That was mostly after the fact of the heavy lifting on the removal, to just maintain things in a way that is friendly and engaging. We did a lot of replanting. This is a volunteer project where we are planting by hand a bunch of little native grass plugs in this is the valley floor. So what you saw in that other photo covered with kudzu, it's cleared, it's mulched, it's stabilized, and now we are replanting natives in it. Here's sort of a picture in picture. The small inside picture is during the project. The outer picture, same shot, is restored with all of the various trees and shrubs on this embankment. that used to be covered with kudzu, now growing up unencumbered. And you can see those same trees in the background were those trees that were just curtained with kudzu previously. And we actually got to work with Prescribed Fire, our one and only site in the metro area where we've been able to use Prescribed Fire to manage the grassland. The best way to manage it is great training for our staff, for City of Atlanta's employees also that were out there. And again, it is the ecological way to manage grasslands. Conservation is one of our more recent endeavors that we've embarked on, and this is conservation of specific tree species. So we got involved with American chestnut restoration around 2010, and that's partnered with the American Chestnut Foundation, which has a local chapter here in Georgia. In case you don't know about the plight of American chestnut, there's an introduced fungal blight. It came from Eastern Asia in the early 1900s that spread starting in New York to the entire range of American chestnut, the entire natural range, preceded by introduction of what's called Phytophthora root rot, which was introduced with the advent of cotton agriculture and moved around on contaminated plants, contaminated tools, contaminated farming implements, and it's sort of a double whammy on American chestnut. So Phytophthora root rot attacks the root, causes what's called root ink disease, makes the roots go black and the whole thing dies. Seriously reduced the historic range of American chestnut. And then on top of that, in the areas that were not affected by Phytophthora, chestnut blight came in and wiped out pretty much everything else. So we consider American chestnut what's called functionally extinct. It's not completely extinct. There are still individuals out there and in cultivation, but it no longer serves a function in ecosystems. Trees Atlanta planted 3 what we call educational orchards, meaning they're not seed orchards, that include some regular American chestnut, some Chinese chestnut, some hybrids between the two of various types, and some really advanced hybrids called back crosses, which have been crossed multiple times. We had 2 of those on the west side, and the third one is escaping me right now. The Carter Center, yes. And there are trees still at our Langhorne Orchard that have survived blight for 10 years that are getting some height on them, and it's exciting to see them. The little inset map there with the red and the green dots, the red ones are dead, and the green ones were still alive at the time this map was made in 2013. So you can kind of see the sort of mortality that even back cross chestnuts that are somewhat, in theory, resistant to blight get if we lost that many trees. We got involved with Longleaf pine conservation in 2011, 2012 in partnership with the Longleaf Alliance. The story behind Longleaf pine, it is a native ecosystem type that was once very extensive over the entire Southeast, and it was heavily cleared for farming, heavily logged because longleaf pine is a great saw timber, and we've got less than 5% of its native range existing now. And a lot of that is not healthy range either. Longleaf pine is an ecosystem that thrives with natural wildfire, so fire suppression throughout the 1900s has also not been great. So what we did initially was planted a demonstration longleaf pine savanna area on the east side BeltLine Trail, about 50 trees. We've got maybe half that number still out there. They're competing with each other, but they're doing great, which goes to show you that if you restore the habitat, a lot of these things that are gone can return. Then in 2019, we added a second big marquee longleaf pine planting at the Bog Arboretum Garden on the West Side Trail, which also has a whole lot of pitcher plants. Very cool if you have a chance to see it. Ash species and hemlock conservation we got involved with next. The issue with green ash and white ash is the introduction of emerald ash borer, that beautiful jewel-like insect there on the right that causes a lot of grief. I've seen numbers as high as 99% mortality expected on our native ash species due to emerald ash borer. Again, means it's going to be functionally extinct in the wild. A lot of the areas where ash grew in Atlanta are bottomland areas, floodplains, and you can go in these spaces now. And a couple of years ago, you've seen a lot of dead ash trees. Now, most of them have fallen over, and it's being colonized by some other tree species, usually box elder. So what Trees Atlanta did initially with Georgia Forestry Commission, we identified that we had areas where emerald ash borer could show up. We set some traps to start seeing, are they here yet? And once we caught some in the traps, we reported it back to Georgia Forestry Commission. And that way they knew, hey, they're here. We're going to put a quarantine around Fulton County for movement of hardwood. What we do now is we treat our planted ash trees so that they can function as sort of a reservoir for, there's two schools of thought about this. We're preserving trees for the sake of preserving them so they don't go extinct. And that is trees in a planted situation on the street. There is value for untreated trees in wild situations because they are the source of resistant genetic material for breeding resistant trees. And that work is going on now. Similar story with our native hemlock species, which are facing high mortality due to another invasive introduced non-native insect, the hemlock woolly adelgid. That's been a bigger issue up in the Appalachian Mountains, but we do have hemlocks, planted hemlocks around Atlanta, and we wanted to raise the visibility and the knowledge of what could happen to them. Right now, all these planted hemlocks in Atlanta serve as a refuge population of hemlocks that could maybe be used if EAB doesn't, if the adelgid doesn't show up here, to reintroduce it to areas where it's gone. So we did outreach with property owners who had hemlocks on their property just to say, hey, you've got this tree. Here's what you need to watch out for on it. Here's what you do if you notice this insect on your trees. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about our in-house restoration staff. Trees Atlanta used to have a one-size-fits-all maintenance staff that worked equally amongst all the programs, and just whoever screamed the loudest got the most help. In about 2013, with the increase in workload on the BeltLine, I started screaming very loudly, probably for more help. And we decided to split up the maintenance staff after that into dedicated staff for each program. And that allowed us to really train employees in a specialized way, particularly in restoration, to where they were trained to a higher level on restoration skills to do some of the things that we had been hiring contractors to do in essence. And so this is one of our earlier staffs here at Ansley Mall. Most of them have gone on to do other things, but that was the start of it. Here's the kind of the growth of the program over 10 years in graph format, for those of you who think in charts. Going back to fiscal year 12, which for us is kind of 2011, 2012 up to the present. And that graph on the left is the sites, the number of sites we've worked per year. And you can see that's a very nice, steady, linear progression year over year. We're up close to 50 sites now, 45, and we were at 10 sites last year. And these are sites that we go to repeatedly throughout the year in a sustained manner. Our budget trends have been a little bit crazier. That spike in the middle, that is due to BeltLine funding coming in. And we did make the decision, y'all will remember from the timeline, to spin BeltLine off into its own program eventually, which kind of stabilized things again for restoration and let us continue to focus on restoration, and BeltLine program at that point could focus on BeltLine. I'm going to talk about Legacy Park, which is a new City of Decatur project that we just started on in 2021. Giant green space. And that allowed us to increase our restoration team almost double the size, I believe. And it allowed us to use some higher level skills we'd really not had the chance to train our staff on yet. And so some of that is chainsaw training and proficiency with invasive tree species that are bigger than we would ever in our right minds have volunteers handle. And previously we had told our own staff, like, hey, don't touch it. So we're increasing the skill level there. We also bought a chipper, which I had been told forever we couldn't have, and finally we could have one because of that large debris. And it's helped us deal with our waste stream a little bit better. Okay.
All right, so I can talk a little bit more about stewardship classes and training, because those are all kind of more recent things that we've started working on. So we've focused a lot more on education and educating the public. Like you saw in the charts that Brian just showed, we have really increased the number of sites that we work in, but there's always going to be a limitation, and we don't want to keep growing our staff forever. So in order to really increase our reach, we wanted to get more involved with educating the public and also educating other organizations. So I'm just going to go through some of the different things that we've offered over the years and continue to. So the first thing that we really started doing was invasive workshops in 2017. And that was really because we were having community groups come to us for advice on how to approach their green space. And if we didn't have any funding for that, we still wanted to train them and teach them what we know. So we set up kind of 3-hour hands-on educational invasive removal and identification courses that were specified for their specific green space. So we taught them the invasives that were in their green space and how to remove them, and kind of a quick and digestible workshop. And so the whole point of that workshop was that they felt empowered to really do something from there and know who to contact, who to get permissions from, how to remove things, and how to get connected. The next thing that we started doing was Greenspace Guardians, and that was in 2018. And Greenspace Guardians was just a fancy name for the volunteer projects that we started hosting regularly. So there are a lot of sites that we've been working in for a very long time. So you saw some of the early sites, including Morningside and Connally and Agnes Scott, all that stuff. And so not all of these sites, because we're working in so many sites, are we going to have consistent funding for. And so this was a way to continue to work in those sites and make sure that we didn't lose any of the progress that we had made. And that was something that we learned pretty early on, is that a lot of progress that we did make in some sites that we had worked in was lost because we didn't continue working in them. So that's something that we really strive for now, is to continue in any way that we can. So we started hosting regularly scheduled monthly projects, either on the first Saturday of the month or something like that. To encourage more community members to come so that it was more regular. And so when we had that buy-in with the community, not only were we continuing to do work with volunteers, but they were spreading the word and organizing their own projects as well. So you can see that list of projects that we initially started this Greenspace Guardians project with, but it's kind of expanded from there. Then also in 2018, we started our forest stewardship. And this is basically like a really expanded invasive workshop. So this is a 4-class series that now is hosted every October, but we've kind of experimented with what dates work best. And the whole goal of the forest stewardship program is to really train individuals who are interested in restoration on all of the knowledge that they would need. So identification skills, removal skills, replanting, community engagement, steps for a management plan and how to enforce it. So a lot more intensive. There's lecture portions and also field portions for each of those classes. And then from that, we have a certified volunteer program. So those who really want a leadership role in Trees Atlanta for volunteering can take this course and then get certified to lead their own monthly projects. And so currently we have 3 certified forest stewards who are leading monthly projects in 3 of those green spaces that I mentioned before. So we have Aaron working in Atlanta Memorial Park, Glenn working at Gilliam Park, and Cole working at Agnes Scott Green Space.
And they're awesome.
They're amazing. And then in 2021, this is a new thing for us. We started professional training. And so this basically came from our invasive workshops, but is much more tailored for anyone who is trying to do invasive removal within their organization in-house instead of using contractors. So we made that switch and felt like this could be another way that we could expand our reach, teach more people what we've learned over the years. And so one that we had recently was with the City of Atlanta Department of Watershed Management. And it was a lot of fun, and we hope to do more training like that in the future. Just a map of current work sites. They're all in pink and they're ever expanding. There's 26 sites in the City of Atlanta that are owned City of Atlanta green spaces and parks, 1 in the City of Brookhaven, 2 in the City of Decatur, 1 in Doraville, 1 in Dunwoody, 1 in East Point. Lots of private property forests that include Fraser Forest and Fernbank Forest. Total acreage of almost 2,000 acres. And kind of before we wrap things up, just to get you guys thinking about some invasive plants, we're just going to go over what we consider and debate on constantly.
We don't always agree.
We don't always agree. The top 5 invasive plants. If anything, it is a good spread of invasive plants that you will commonly know.
I've made my peace with it.
They're not necessarily the ones that are most common in Georgia, but they are definitely ones that are commonly planted or you see escaping in an urban setting. So one is kudzu, big surprise there. The plant that ate the South, great picture on the right there. It'll tear down trees, really kill canopy trees, and then resorted to this kind of like moonscape. So it was planted all over the South in the early 20th century on purpose, using taxpayer dollars to help reduce erosion because we had such poor farming practices. So that's the reason that it pops up everywhere now. It'll pop up anywhere that there isn't consistent maintenance happening, along highways, public parks, abandoned lots. During its peak growing season, it can grow up to 1 foot a day, and therefore outcompetes any plant growing near it, including other invasives. So as soon as we start removing kudzu, then we get a diversity of invasives, which at least is a diversity of something, I guess. And well-established kudzu roots can weigh up to 400 pounds, but they have a really robust storage system underground, and that's why they're so difficult to remove and why oftentimes chemical treatment is needed in order to control this plant. Some more beautiful photos. It does actually have a really lovely flower and it smells like grape. Chinese wisteria, another one. This is planted as an ornamental, introduced in the US in the early 1900s as an ornamental plant. It's still commonly planted because it does have a very, very beautiful flower. But this vine grows up trees, and you'll see it kind of along roadways, like how you see in this picture with all the purple flowers blooming in early spring. It kind of grows by twisting or twining its way up a branch or a trunk. And then as the plant grows, the vine doesn't give, and then it ends up girdling or strangling the tree, and that's how it can kill adult canopy trees. And it often takes us longer to remove Chinese wisteria than kudzu, which is not as fun of a fact for us. There is a native species called the American wisteria. So if you really love the way wisteria looks, you can plant this instead. The American wisteria flower is on the right, Chinese wisteria is on the left. Chinese privet, this is another one that is really commonly planted as an ornamental. It was commonly used as a hedge for a very long time. Privet actually takes up more space in our forest than kudzu does and can be just as harmful. It just takes a longer time. So these shrubs are evergreen, and so they grow all year long, and a lot of our native species are deciduous, and so they don't have that advantage. but they end up creating this really dense layer in the understory, preventing sunlight from getting to the forest floor. And so then you don't have the next generation of canopy trees growing in the forest to replace those old trees when it's their time to die. And then you end up with just a privet forest.
What is the best way for us to remove privet?
So for a Chinese privet, if they're small, the best thing you can do is uproot it. If it's larger, what we do is we treat the stump with a high concentrate herbicide. But if it's in your own yard, you are welcome to hack away. That is more of an efficiency thing for us. And also it regrows very readily. So I tried to do it manually in my yard once, and 3 years later, I was still cutting back regrowth. English ivy. So English ivy was brought to the US by colonial settlers as an ornamental. It's often planted as a ground cover in yards, spreads vegetatively to neighboring properties, and then when it climbs trees or climbs vertically, that's when it's able to produce berries and spread into other green spaces or other areas around the city. And the problem with this is if you look at the picture on the right, that's a lot of extra leaves on the trunk where they wouldn't normally be, which causes wind to get trapped and kind of it acts like a sail on the trunk of the tree, making them far more likely to fall during a storm event. So that ends up pulling down trees in forested areas as well, and also really reduces the diversity of wildflowers and woodland plants on the forest floor, prevents them from germinating or developing. Monkey grass, this is the one that we debate on. So I put this one in here because it's really commonly planted as a ground cover, very commonly planted because it grows well in shade. It has these pretty flowers, but they do also produce berries, and they do spread very readily into our forested areas, are harder sometimes for us to remove than English ivy because of their rhizomes. And this plant we do have some native alternatives for, but really native ferns are a great alternative as well for shady ground cover. But blue-eyed grass in sunny spots, which is to the right, is a native that also has very beautiful flowers that you can use to replace it. So those are the top 5 invasives, and I'm just gonna finish up by saying some ways that you can get involved if restoration is something that is interesting to you, and then we can take any questions that you guys have. So some ways that you can help: you can plant native. Doug Talamy funded or started this nonprofit called Homegrown National Park. He is an entomologist who has really studied specialized insects and their relationships to native plants. And he has a plethora of really great resources and books that he's written. And he has this movement where if everyone plants natives in their own little corner of the world, we'd have a larger or more native plants and ecosystem coverage than any of our largest national parks in the US. And here's some sources for native plants, because I know they can be hard to find. There's a list of native plant nurseries on Georgia Native Plant Society's website. And then University of Georgia also has a great list of native plant nurseries. And this is being recorded too, if you can't write down these URLs fast enough, but you can also find them through their website. And then some local native plant sales. Chattahoochee Nature Center has one annually. Georgia Audubon, Trees Atlanta has one in the spring for native plants specifically. And then Georgia Native Plant Society also has a native plant sale. The local chapters do. You can conserve ecosystems. So you can start by learning how to identify the plants growing in your yard and community. So you even know what's growing there, what's native, what's non-native, what's invasive. We really like to promote the cell phone app iNaturalist because it's pretty accurate and it's really fun to use. You can remove invasive plants from your yard and get to know the plants that are invasive to Atlanta and Georgia. Georgia Exotic Pest Plant Council is a great resource for that if you're looking for a all-encompassing list of invasive plants of Georgia. You can volunteer with us to learn more about how we remove invasives. We also have some resources on our website if you like to learn more. And you can lead restoration efforts in your community. And finally, educate others. This is a really big problem because the burden is on the consumer and homeowners and all of us. And I wish that wasn't the case, but it is for now. So teach your friends, family, and neighbors about the importance of restoration, the importance of native plants, and why invasive plants are harming our ecosystems. Talk to your elected officials about legislation that could be passed to restrict buying and selling of invasive plants, and legislation that could promote the planting of native plants. And ask your local plant nurseries to sell more native plants. We need them in more places. Encourage them to stop selling invasive plants, and maybe encourage them to label plants as native or non-native to help decrease the burden on the consumer. And that is all we've got. So if you have any questions, I'll hand it over to Vanessa.
Thank you so much, Brian and Taryn. I really appreciate it. And I'm sure our audience does as well. I'm going to go through some questions that have come through both in the chat as well as our Q&A.
Do you want me to stop sharing?
No, if anything, I would ask though, if you go back, I think a few slides that shared, that
Plant native.
word. Yes, just in case anyone wants to collect that information. Thank you. We have a question from Chandler. What are some common invasive species for the Georgia region? I know you did delve into that a little bit, but if you just wanted to give a quick recap for anyone who may have popped in late.
Do you want to give your other favorites?
I'll give some alternates, but Taryn's list was Chinese Privet, Chinese Wisteria, Kudzu, English Ivy, and monkey grass. Others you might add to that, here's my fifth, was Japanese honeysuckle, which is another good one to know. Japanese climbing fern should also be on a list that's in Georgia. Japanese chapflower, Elaeagnus, also known as autumn olive. I mean, the list goes on and on. It is ridiculously long. A good resource would be the U.S. Forest Service has a digital publication that shows invasive plants in southern forests that you can find on their website.
We also just added a resource to our website that has around 40 of really common invasive plants to Atlanta specifically.
The list is longer than I'd like it to be, but we're comprehensive on there. It'd be nice if we had fewer invasive species to deal with.
Great, thank you, Brian. Another question, how do you safely remove invasive species without destroying the rest of the habitat?
Yes, so that's a really good question. So what we have done is it was nice for us to start as an organization by doing management plans and really collecting a lot of information, and then working with a lot of different contractors so we can see how they do it and compile that information over time. And so what we do now professionally has been, iteration after iteration after iteration. And so what we follow is integrated pest management. And so the goal of that is to use methods that are effective, but also you cause the least amount of harm. And so that really depends on the species that you're working with, other species that are present, if there are sensitive species nearby, and then also if you're near certain types of hydrology, if you're worried about erosion. So all of that needs to be taken into context. So there are in some places and locations where manual removal is the better way to go, because you would be disturbing really sensitive vegetation if you tried to use chemical control. And then there are some instances in where chemical control is much better, because in order to manually remove it, you would essentially have to recreate a site, or you would cause so much erosion and soil disturbance that would cause more environmental harm. So it really does depend. If there's a specific question that you can always email us at restoration@treesatlanta.org. But we also have a resource online that's meant for the homeowner that really includes some chemical control, but is mostly manual removal. And that is for our list of 10 invasive species. We're working to expand that to include all of the species that we have on our website, but that's a good guide that you can look at.
Thank you, Taryn. Next question is, where's the landfill that was going to become? So where's the, I believe
Lake Charlotte is probably what that question. So if you go down Moreland Avenue towards I-285, on the right-hand side, There are actually multiple landfills when you get down to that stretch of moorland, but this is the Live Oak landfill that is just north of 285 on Moreland. And Lake Charlotte is right next to it, and it was owned by the same company that owns that landfill, and it was bought. The land was bought as expansion space for that landfill up until the point where City of Atlanta stopped permitting new landfills.
I'm also just going to shout out this because I'm leading this project on Saturday and we need more people for it. It's an amazing site. If you haven't been to Lake Charlotte Nature Preserve yet, it's amazing. There's also a lot of shagbark hickories there, which is a picture right here, which is not a common tree that you see within the metro area. It also has a lot of cool kind of archaeological significance that we'll talk about, so I won't spoil it here.
Thank you so much for that. Another question, why are invasives still sold in nurseries and garden centers? I cringe when I see English ivy for sale.
I could go on about this for like an hour.
I think in a nutshell, the non-controversial answer that all would agree on is the reason those plants are being sold is because they perform well. And the reason they perform well and that all the people are like, it's pest-free, you won't have to worry about it. It's because there are no insects and diseases here in North America that really, truly affect these non-native plants. And that is precisely the problem with why they become invasive. There are no checks. There is no natural competition for them. And that is why they are sold, because you can plant it and you never have to worry about it. You can neglect it and it looks great.
So yeah, pest resistant, grows fast. I will say another reason is that a lot of people are using it. And if people don't really know anything about plants, they look to their neighbors or their friends to see what they should be planting. And so if that's what other people have in their yard, they're going to ask for it. And so there's been issues too where nurseries are trying to not sell invasives, but people keep demanding it. And so that's why it kind of needs to be like a social movement as well of what our landscapes should look like. And that's why the BeltLine is also a really important project, because that is really kind of trying to alter perceptions of what is beautiful in a landscape and what you can do with your yard.
So we had a comment, Chandler also wanted to add on to that. On that note, is there some way we can encourage lawmakers to take action?
You can always write to your members of Congress and your local lawmakers as well to say, here's what I believe and here's what I'd like to see you or somebody working on. Some states are ahead of us. For example, state of Florida has a requirement with new development that a certain percentage of the landscaping is native. And so as a result, the native landscape industry in Florida is a lot better developed than the one in Georgia. So it is, be vocal about it. And walk the walk as well as talking the talk. So what you plant, if you own a home, what Taryn said, that's what your neighbors see. And if they see something good, something that's good looking in your yard and it's a native and they ask you what it is and you tell them, you can push somebody in the right direction.
Awesome. So we do have quite a bit of questions. If we could move through these. We have a comment. Can you please offer services to the City of Decatur's Park Department?
Offer services as in?
The City of Decatur probably has a bid system, just like every other city, and we work with them, but they're competitively bidding, I'm sure, a lot of their work. So they'll contract jobs. We don't do necessarily all the jobs. But I guess if this is in terms of, could we train their parks people like we trained the watershed people in Atlanta? I don't know if that's a discussion we've had yet. But.
Yeah, I think this is kind of an ongoing thing, is that, and something that we would like to expand on. I think a lot of municipalities would love to do it in-house. And I've heard Decatur mention that they would like to start doing that in-house. It's a matter of how they do it, because training your staff is one thing, but you also have to hire someone that probably is pretty knowledgeable to lead that group. And so there's a lot of steps that go into that. And so it doesn't just take one training. Like, that is helpful to kind of share knowledge, but at the end of the day, you need staff that are really knowledgeable on how to do that. And that can take legislation to get those positions passed and all that kind of stuff.
So another comment, can you please look into getting involved with the restoration at Glen Emerald Lake in DeKalb County?
Glen.
Emerald.
Glen Emerald. We don't have as robust, I would say, a relationship with DeKalb County parks as we have historically. And so we typically haven't done as much with those parks that aren't in a municipality in DeKalb. But I feel like there's always room for us to grow.
Yeah, we can take a
And
peek.
some of the ways we start working in places is interested stakeholders in the community contact us. And, you know, even if we don't have, let's say, this type of funding for something, there's always grant funding too, that it does help us to know what is out there, what need is out there, so that we can pair things up when funding streams become available.
Another question, are blackberry shrubs considered native or near native? I love them, but people consider them a nuisance and clear them.
It depends on there's a lot of different species of blackberry.
There are several native blackberries, and most of us would probably consider them native weeds. It is not invasive. It acts in a weedy nature. It's aggressive. It's early successional, but many of them are native. There is Himalayan blackberry, which is a non-native, arguably invasive species of blackberry that we are seeing increasingly. And those tend to be taller. The vines, the canes are bigger around. The prickles are stouter. The fruit is delicious. Is one
why
of
it
the
was
earmarks. So there is an invasive blackberry out there, but I will not say that as a blanket statement. Most of the blackberries you are seeing around Atlanta are native, and they are just trying to find a little bit of light. They don't grow well in the shade. So kind of the end of their story is once an area gets good canopy over it, they tend to naturally sort of not be as prolific.
I will say that they are kind of working against prairie ecosystems. And so that's something that we have to manage whenever we have little pocket prairies or on the BeltLine, because they will kind of make it messy and then allow shrubs to dominate, and then you shade out the grasses. So that's kind of the biggest issue that we have with blackberries.
Nice. Could removing the berries from monkey grass help prevent it from spreading? I think you touched on this briefly.
Yeah, and that's kind of the case with a lot of these invasives, right? If you already have them in your yard and you don't want to get rid of them, but you want to prevent them from spreading, removing the berries is always a step that you can take. Monkey grass will also kind of creep vegetatively.
But slowly.
Yeah.
And that's one you can actually reach to remove the berries from. You could not remove all the berries off English ivy climbing up a tree.
No, you just prevent it from climbing up a tree. Or like Chinese privet, there's just a lot of berries going
on. And we have one last question, not related to invasive species, but just to squeeze this in there. Trees Atlanta planted a tree in the space between the sidewalk and a tree. The leader branch has died. What needs to be done for this plant to keep it growing up healthy?
A new leader needs to be selected. I don't want to get out of my depth here, because this is a arboricultural question. And you would have to see this, I would have to see the specific tree to really and truly answer this, because sometimes with most young trees, you just select a new leader. Certain species like a pine, if the leader breaks, you're in trouble if they're strongly single leadered. But things like an oak, if that main leader breaks, another branch will take over, and you just kind of have to stake it up into place where it becomes the new leader.
But we also have free pruning classes if you'd like to learn more about how to prune and train them into that.
Yes.
Yeah.
So when you sign up for the newsletter on our website, you'll get more information on when the next pruning training will be. This is the very last question. What are a few native understory plants that can be bought at local nurseries that you can recommend for residences?
There are great ones. And it is gonna, when you say understory, sometimes people also mean ground cover. And so we could either mean truly understory, like it's in shade or part shade, or some people might just be looking for ground cover that could also grow in sun. So if we're talking true understory here, you're going to have areas that are wetter and areas that are drier. You might have dry shade versus damp shade. Some good plants for dry shade is almost impossible to get understory plants to grow in, but river oat will grow in dry shade. That's a native grass. That's a tough one. I'm not coming up with any other good ones. Other vines that will grow in shade that are native, Virginia creeper is one that'll grow in kind of part shade and will cover the ground very effectively. Yeah, muscadine, perhaps, although that's more of a climber. There are some native perennials like foam flower, which likes a moister shade. That would be a good substitute. Where you're going to run up is there's not a lot of evergreen options available. And I know people like to do a lot of evergreen ground covers, but you can explore our native yellow jasmine, Carolina jasmine. Does like a little bit of sun to really flower. Crossvine will also kind of scramble across the ground, but again, it wants something to climb on. So most of our native vines do not like to stay on the ground. They like to climb up things as quickly as possible, and they don't cover the ground quite like English ivy does or winter creeper does. Taryn, did I miss any good ones? Ferns.
Yeah, there are a
Ferns.
lot of ones. And he was talking about like if it's bone dry, because in deep shade, typically our forest wouldn't have much growing on the understory, which that's why in Lake Charlotte it's dry and there's like blankets of muscadine everywhere, and that's pretty much it. And river oats, but there's plenty of ones if you have some moisture in the ground. And we've got many different ephemerals, meaning they're blooming only in the springtime. And lots of like flowering things like woodland phlox, cardinal flower, columbine.
Native ferns, you could go crazy with native ferns. There are deciduous types. There are actually evergreen native ferns like Christmas fern. And some ferns like drier shade, some ferns like wetter shade.
Great. Again, thank you so much, Taryn and Brian, for taking the time to answer these questions. We are so thankful for those who have attended. There was a lot of conversation in the chat box, so I'm glad they were able to get this information. Again, if you have not already signed up for our newsletter, please do so going at www.treesatlanta.org and follow us on our social media platforms, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And we look forward to you joining us again, either virtually for our events or in person. Please check out our website for upcoming events as well. So thank you so much, and we will see you again another time.
See you guys for Forest.